close your eyes. Somewhere in the South Pacific, in the summer of 2019, 6 people gathered for dinner on a small tropical island. They had traveled far, from China, through the circuits of a digital scheme that had reached millions of people, across the blockchain records that documented every transaction they had ever made. They had arrived on Vanuatu, a nation of 83 islands scattered across the Pacific, known for its relative isolation and its distance from the centers of global financial law enforcement. They had not announced their destination. The money they had accumulated was not with them, not in any physical sense. It was distributed across a network of digital wallets, protected by cryptographic keys, moving through the blockchain in patterns designed to be difficult to follow. Somewhere between $2 and $7 billion, most of it in Bitcoin and Ethereum. The precise figure depended on which day you checked the price, and prices had been moving in directions the operators had not entirely planned for. What the money represented was this: the savings of more than 2 million people. People in China, South Korea, Japan, and across Southeast Asia. People who had downloaded a mobile application called PlusToken, who had been told it paid monthly returns of 9 to 18% on cryptocurrency deposits, who had transferred their Bitcoin and Ethereum and watched the numbers in their accounts grow for a while. People who had trusted the recommendation of a friend or a cousin or a colleague who had personally received those returns and vouched for the platform. The island was the kind of place that appeared from a distance like a reasonable place to disappear. Far from China's enforcement infrastructure, far from the international legal networks that made extradition routine in Europe or North America. The 6 men on Vanuatu were not hiding, exactly. They had not changed their identities, had not gone underground in any dramatic sense. They were waiting. They believed they had done what they came to do. They believed the distance was sufficient, the trail was cold, the world had other things to focus on. It was not. Chinese authorities had developed intelligence. Vanuatu had cooperated. And the arrests that followed, in late July 2019, on a Pacific island selected for its obscurity, would become the opening act of an investigation that eventually convicted 109 people across multiple rounds of proceedings. It was the largest criminal prosecution in the history of cryptocurrency fraud. PlusToken. The name sounds almost benign. A plus sign, a token, an addition, something that adds to what you have. What it was, in fact, was the largest cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme the world had ever recorded, a machine for converting trust into profit, for taking the savings of people who believed in a digital future and funneling those savings into the accounts of people who had no intention of returning them. The platform was real. The application was real. The returns were real, for a time. The source of those returns was not. The story of how it was built, how it grew to reach 2 million investors across multiple countries, and how it collapsed into a criminal case that would reshape China's approach to cryptocurrency fraud. That is what the night holds. To understand PlusToken, you need to understand 2017. In 2017, the cryptocurrency market did something that most financial observers thought was impossible. Bitcoin climbed from under $1,000 to nearly $20,000 in a single year. Ethereum went from $8 to over $1,300. Litecoin, Ripple, Monero, assets that had traded in obscurity for years, suddenly appeared in news headlines, on television, in conversations at family dinners among people who had never previously discussed blockchain technology or digital currencies. The gains were real, and they were enormous, and they were public. People who had bought small amounts of cryptocurrency years earlier and never thought about it again woke up to find themselves unexpectedly wealthy. The stories circulated everywhere. The person who put a few $100s into Bitcoin in 2013 and now owned a house. The student who mined Ethereum as a hobby and now had enough to pay off their university debt. These stories were not exaggerations. The gains of the 2017 bull run were so extraordinary that even modest early investments had produced life-changing returns. And the stories spread, not just through media coverage, but through the direct testimony of people who had experienced the gains themselves. For the first time in most people's financial lives, there was an asset class that seemed to be producing extraordinary returns, not for hedge funds and institutional investors, but for ordinary people sitting at their kitchen tables with a smartphone and an account on a cryptocurrency exchange. The accessibility was part of the appeal. You did not need a broker. You did not need a minimum account size. You needed an internet connection and the willingness to act. For millions of people across China and East Asia, where smartphone penetration was high, where digital payment infrastructure was already embedded in daily life, and where the ordinary person had fewer pathways to traditional investment markets than their counterparts in the West, the appeal was particularly acute. Then came January 2018. Bitcoin fell from nearly $20,000 to $6,000 over the course of the first quarter. Ethereum fell from $1,300 to under $500. The stories shifted. The headlines that had celebrated ordinary people getting rich became headlines about ordinary people losing everything. The millions who had bought at the peak were devastated. The people who had watched from the sidelines felt simultaneously relieved and frustrated. Relieved they hadn't lost money, frustrated they hadn't gotten in earlier when the gains were still accumulating. Everyone had an opinion. Almost no one had a clear framework for understanding what had just happened or what would happen next. Into that specific emotional environment, the residual memory of enormous gains, the sting of recent losses, the anxiety of a market that seemed to be recovering but slowly, the desire to find a way to participate without the volatility that had burned so many people, came PlusToken. The platform launched in 2018, presenting itself as a smart cryptocurrency wallet. The pitch was precise. Deposit your Bitcoin or Ethereum, earn monthly returns of 9 to 18%. The exact rate depended on how much you deposited and how many people you referred to the platform. That referral structure was not incidental. It was the core of how PlusToken was designed to grow. Every user who recruited a new user received a percentage of what their recruit earned. The recruit had an incentive to recruit others. The chain extended outward through social networks, through family groups, through the WeChat communities that were the primary communication infrastructure for hundreds of millions of Chinese users, through the personal trust that ran along those networks like current through a wire. The 9 to 18% monthly figure deserves a moment of attention. That is not 9 to 18% per year, a return that would already be extraordinary by the standards of traditional investment. It is 9 to 18% per month, compounding. At 18% monthly, $100 would become nearly $8,000 in a year. At 9% monthly, it would become nearly $2,900. The figures were implausible when examined with a clear head, as the product of any legitimate investment activity. Against the backdrop of a market that had recently produced 10,000% gains in a single year, they seemed merely aggressive. By 2019, PlusToken claimed more than 10 million users. Independent estimates, based on blockchain analysis of the wallets associated with the scheme, put the number of active investors closer to 2 million. Even the conservative estimate was staggering. 2 million people who had deposited real cryptocurrency into a platform they believed was generating real returns through some legitimate combination of trading activity, arbitrage, and network effects. 2 million people who had told their families and colleagues about the platform and been believed. There was no trading operation. There were no investment strategies. There were no algorithms generating returns. There were only new deposits flowing in. Some fraction of them paid back out to maintain the credibility of the returns, the rest accumulating in wallets controlled by the people who had built the scheme. The people who ran PlusToken understood their audience with a precision that suggested careful study. They built the platform to look and feel like a legitimate financial technology company. The mobile application was professionally designed, clean interface, smooth navigation, features that mimicked real cryptocurrency wallets and investment tracking dashboards. There was a live balance display, a transaction history organized by date, a referral network tracker showing how many people were in your downline and what you were earning from their activity. The interface communicated competence and reliability in exactly the visual language that users of legitimate financial applications had learned to associate with trustworthiness. This was not accidental. The operators had studied what legitimate platforms looked like and built something that matched. The community infrastructure was equally sophisticated. PlusToken maintained an extensive network of official WeChat groups, the primary social platform for over 1 billion Chinese users, where moderators answered questions, shared educational content about cryptocurrency markets, celebrated users who had reached investment milestones, and maintained a continuous atmosphere of positivity and collective purpose. The groups were managed with consistency and professionalism. Questions were answered promptly. Concerns were addressed with patience. The experience of participating in the community reinforced continuously the sense that this was a legitimate enterprise run by competent people who cared about their users. The testimonials were the most powerful element of the operation. Early investors who received their monthly returns, who checked their accounts and watched the numbers growing, who made withdrawal requests and saw the funds arrive in their external wallets, became the platform's most effective marketing channel without being employed by it. They posted in WeChat groups. They told family members. They brought friends to recruitment events that the operators organized in cities across China. They were not lying when they vouched for the platform. At that moment, their experience was genuine. The returns they had received were real deposits in real wallets. The fact that those returns were funded by new depositors rather than any legitimate investment activity was structurally invisible to them. This is how Ponzi schemes propagate, not through crude deception, where someone tells a lie and a victim chooses to believe it. The early investors in PlusToken had genuine experience of genuine returns. Their testimony was factually accurate in every way they could verify. They became the scheme's most powerful advocates, not because they were simple or gullible, but because they were incorporated into a structure where their real experience perfectly concealed the mechanism that produced it. The multi-level marketing structure amplified the social trust dynamics in a specific way. A recruiter did not merely introduce friends to an investment platform. The recruiter had a financial stake in the friend's success, a percentage of the returns the recruit generated. This meant the recruiter had every incentive to remain optimistic, to address doubts, to explain away concerning signs, to stay invested in the belief that the platform was legitimate even as early warning signs appeared. The structure made advocates out of investors and made the advocates' financial well-being dependent on their continued advocacy. The scheme operated primarily through a network of operators led by Chen Bo, who managed the platform's financial flows and coordinated the senior tiers of the recruiting network. The structure beneath Chen Bo was layered: regional operators who managed city-level networks, community leaders who ran WeChat groups and organized recruitment events, individual recruiters who brought in friends and family. Each layer had a financial relationship to the layers below it. The scheme was not just a Ponzi structure. It was a Ponzi structure built on top of a multi-level marketing network, with the MLM providing both the growth mechanism and the social adhesive that kept investors committed. At its peak, PlusToken held approximately 194,775 Bitcoin and 833,083 Ethereum. These figures come from blockchain analysis conducted after the scheme's collapse, tracing the wallets associated with the operation through the public ledger. At the prices that prevailed during 2017's peak, that quantity of Bitcoin alone would have been worth nearly $4 billion. At mid-2019 prices, the combined holdings were worth somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. The scheme had accumulated, over roughly a year and a half of operation, one of the largest pools of cryptocurrency ever controlled by a single organization, legitimate or otherwise. In June 2019, PlusToken began to collapse in public. Withdrawal requests slowed, then froze. Users who tried to move funds out of the platform received error messages. Customer service channels that had previously been responsive went quiet. The WeChat groups that had been so active, so full of testimonials and monthly earnings updates and encouragement, shifted tone. Worried questions, absent moderators. The specific silence of a platform that has nothing useful left to say to its users because it has already taken what it came for. The operators posted an announcement. The platform, they explained, had been hacked. There were technical difficulties. Funds were safe and being secured. Users should be patient while the team resolved the issue. The message was calibrated to sound plausible. Hacks were a real phenomenon in cryptocurrency, and users who had encountered exchange outages or security incidents before had frameworks for understanding temporary disruptions. The claim was specifically designed to give investors a reason to wait rather than panic, to hold on for one more week, one more month, one more announcement. Investors who had seen other collapses recognized the pattern immediately. The claim of an external problem, the vague reassurance that funds were safe, the sudden disappearance of anyone with real authority from the communication channels, the withdrawal freeze that extended indefinitely with each passing deadline met by another explanation and another delay. This is the script of an exit scam, and it is consistent across financial history because the human dynamics it exploits are consistent. People who have money in a platform want very much to believe the platform's explanation because the alternative is accepting that the money is gone. For the vast majority of PlusToken's 2 million investors, this was their first encounter with this pattern. They had not seen other collapses. They had joined the platform on the recommendation of someone they trusted, had personally experienced months of returns, had brought other people in who had also received returns. They had no framework for understanding that a platform could look exactly like this: professional, community-supported, consistently paying out, and still be built entirely on the expectation of this moment. The confusion was genuine, and the distress was acute. By July 2019, 6 of PlusToken's key operators had arrived in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a small island nation in the South Pacific, a former colonial territory of both Britain and France that gained independence in 1980. It has a population of roughly 300,000 people spread across dozens of islands. It is not a major financial center. It does not have extensive bilateral law enforcement cooperation treaties with China. It was, from the operator's perspective, a place selected for its distance from the investigation that was clearly coming. A jurisdiction where they might settle in long enough to establish new plans, new identities, new pathways forward. What they had not fully accounted for was the extent to which Chinese authorities were already moving. The investigation had begun before the scheme publicly collapsed. Intelligence work that identified the key operators and eventually their movements. The specifics of how 6 people were tracked to a Pacific island they had presumably selected for its obscurity were not fully disclosed in the public record of the case. What was disclosed was the outcome: Chinese authorities made a formal request to Vanuatu law enforcement. Vanuatu cooperated. In late July 2019, the 6 operators were detained and the extradition process began. The arrests in Vanuatu were the opening move, not the conclusion. The network behind PlusToken extended through multiple Chinese provinces and involved dozens of people at various levels of the operation. The senior regional operators who had managed city-level networks, the event organizers who had run recruitment seminars, the WeChat group administrators who had maintained the community infrastructure. The investigation required identifying each of these roles, establishing the nature of each person's involvement, and building evidence strong enough to support prosecution. That work would continue through late 2019 and well into 2020. The stolen cryptocurrency was not sitting still. From the moment PlusToken publicly froze in June 2019, the operators had been moving funds. The exit strategy had been built into the operation alongside everything else, planned well in advance, executing even as withdrawal requests from investors piled up unanswered. The question for investigators and the blockchain analysts who began tracking the funds almost immediately was not whether the money was moving, but where it was going, at what rate, and through what channels. The blockchain gave them a place to start. The methods PlusToken's operators used to move and liquidate their holdings were more sophisticated than those used in most cryptocurrency fraud cases. They employed coin mixing, which is the practice of combining cryptocurrency from multiple sources in a single transaction and distributing the outputs in a way that makes it difficult to determine which input funded which output. A simple transaction, Alice sends Bob 1 Bitcoin, is easily traceable on the blockchain. A mixing transaction that combines inputs from 100 different wallets and distributes outputs to 100 different destinations creates an analytical problem that takes significant computational work to untangle. The operators also used over-the-counter trading desks, which facilitated large cryptocurrency transactions privately. OTC desks served institutional clients and large individual traders who needed to move significant quantities of cryptocurrency without affecting market prices through public exchange order books. They operated with minimal compliance requirements compared to regulated exchanges. For a fraudster trying to liquidate billions of dollars in stolen cryptocurrency, OTC desks offered speed and privacy that public exchanges did not. They converted between different cryptocurrencies, adding additional analytical layers. They split holdings across hundreds of wallets to prevent any single transaction from appearing conspicuous. Chainalysis, the blockchain analytics firm, dedicated sustained analytical resources to tracing the PlusToken funds through the second half of 2019 and into 2020. The work produced a finding that had implications beyond the criminal case. The PlusToken operators had been selling Bitcoin in ongoing tranches throughout this period. Based on the on-chain patterns, Chainalysis estimated that the scheme had been liquidating somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 Bitcoin per month. That was enough, at the price levels of late 2019, to represent hundreds of millions of dollars in sustained monthly selling pressure on a market that was struggling to recover from the 2018 crash. The correlation between PlusToken liquidation events and Bitcoin price action was, once identified, difficult to dismiss. When the analysts mapped the timing of large PlusToken sales against Bitcoin's price chart, significant drops aligned with periods of elevated OTC selling activity they had identified through blockchain forensics. A Ponzi scheme of sufficient scale was not just a crime against its direct victims. It was a systemic event that affected every person holding cryptocurrency in the market, whether they had ever heard of PlusToken or not. The liquidation of a $2 billion pool of stolen Bitcoin depressed prices across the entire market. The blockchain, despite all the obfuscation techniques the operators employed, retained the fundamental characteristic that made it useful for investigators. Everything was recorded. Every transaction, every wallet address, every mixing operation, every OTC desk interaction, all of it existed on the public ledger, permanent and immutable, waiting to be analyzed. The mixing could shuffle the coins. It could not erase the fact that the coins had been shuffled. The patterns of behavior that blockchain analysts had developed techniques to identify, the specific ways that mixing transactions were structured, the behavioral signatures of wallets under common control, the timing patterns that revealed coordinated activity, were present throughout the PlusToken fund movements. The collaboration between blockchain analytics companies and law enforcement that this investigation required represented something relatively new in financial crime investigation. Analytics firms contributed technical capabilities that investigators could not generate internally. Law enforcement contributed legal authority, warrants, subpoenas, international cooperation requests, the ability to compel exchanges to identify the real people behind wallet addresses. Together, the combination could trace the movement of billions of dollars across a global network with a precision that neither could achieve alone. The PlusToken investigation became an early demonstration of what that collaboration could produce at maximum scale. The PlusToken investigation was the largest cryptocurrency fraud prosecution China had ever conducted. The scale created distinctive challenges. The scheme had operated through a multi-level marketing structure with many layers, which meant that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people had participated in some way in spreading it. Most of them were themselves victims, people who had genuinely believed in the platform, who had recruited friends and family members in good faith, based on their own positive experience of the returns, who had earned referral fees they did not understand were funded by fraud. Distinguishing those people from the knowing participants, the operators who had built the scheme, the regional coordinators who understood what they were running, the administrators who had maintained the social infrastructure while knowing its purpose, required careful and sustained analytical work. The investigation coordinated across multiple Chinese provinces, following the regional structure of PlusToken's recruiting network. Evidence was drawn from encrypted messaging platform records, blockchain transaction data, financial account information across multiple jurisdictions, testimony from participants at various levels of the network, and the documentation that investigators recovered in the course of arrests and searches. Chinese authorities had a specific advantage in this particular case. Most of the infrastructure PlusToken had used to grow, the WeChat groups, the domestic exchange accounts, the banking connections, was within Chinese jurisdiction. That concentration made evidence collection significantly faster and more comprehensive than a cross-border investigation would have been. The challenge of distinguishing knowing participants from genuine victims was not merely legal, it was also ethical. The person who had run a regional recruiting network and earned substantial referral fees while spreading the scheme through their city was in a different position than the person who had brought in 3 friends and received modest referrals before the collapse. The person who had continued to reassure investors as late as July 2019 that the platform was experiencing temporary technical difficulties was in a different position than the person who had stopped actively recruiting in March 2019 when early warning signs appeared. The investigation had to make these distinctions at scale, across hundreds of people. For the investors, the criminal proceedings represented a form of accountability that fell well short of recovery. The money was gone. Some of it had been liquidated before any arrests were made, converted to cash through OTC desks, and dispersed through channels that investigators were still working to trace. Some remained in wallets that investigators had identified but not yet accessed, wallets whose private keys were controlled by people who had not yet been arrested, or who were not cooperating, or whose keys had been structured in ways designed to survive arrests. The mathematics of recovery were bleak from the beginning, and most investors understood this even as the legal proceedings moved forward. The emotional dimensions of the losses carried a particular weight because of how PlusToken had spread. The scheme had not reached 2 million people through impersonal advertising. It had reached 2 million people through the most powerful distribution channel human beings possess: personal recommendation from someone already trusted. The recruiter was your older sister who had received 6 months of returns and felt certain about the platform. The person who vouched for PlusToken was your former university classmate who was seeing his account grow and wanted to share that with you. When the platform collapsed, the losses did not fall only on individuals, they fell on relationships. People who had recommended PlusToken to their parents, to their siblings, to their closest friends, faced not just the loss of their own investment, but the loss of those people's investments and the relational damage that came with it. The feeling of having caused harm to people you loved through an honest recommendation that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. That is a specific kind of grief. It does not resolve when the courts hand down sentences. It does not resolve when the perpetrators go to prison. It lives in the relationships that carry the memory of what was trusted and what was lost. In June 2020, a Chinese court sentenced the first major group of PlusToken defendants. The lead figure, Chen Bo, received a sentence of 11 years in prison. The sentencing was accompanied by asset forfeiture, cryptocurrency holdings, and other property seized during the course of the investigation. The court made explicit the scale of what had been done: more than 2 million victims, losses totaling more than 40 billion yuan, approximately $6 billion at then current exchange rates, distributed across investors in China, South Korea, Japan, and multiple Southeast Asian countries. The numbers were not estimates or allegations. They had been established through the kind of documentary evidence the blockchain provided: a permanent record of every deposit, every distribution, every withdrawal that had ever moved through the scheme. 27 major defendants were sentenced in that first wave. The evidence presented in the proceedings was unusually comprehensive, in part because of the blockchain record, and in part because of the extensive WeChat and communications data that Chinese investigators had obtained through domestic legal channels. The prosecution did not need to rely primarily on witness testimony that could be contradicted or recanted. The blockchain had recorded the transactions. The messaging platforms had recorded the coordination. The evidence was there in the digital record in ways that would have been impossible to assemble in a pre-digital fraud case of comparable scale. The structure of the sentences in the first wave reflected the structure of the scheme. The architects received the longest terms, not just Chen Bo, but the other senior operators who had built and managed the platform and its financial operations. The regional operators who had run city-level recruiting networks received shorter but still significant prison terms. The range of sentences acknowledged that culpability varied across the network, that the person who had designed and run the Ponzi structure occupied a fundamentally different position than the person who had managed a WeChat group for recruiting purposes. Additional proceedings followed the June 2020 sentencing. The investigation had extended deep into the network, well beyond the senior figures who had been arrested first. Secondary operators, event organizers, communication coordinators, people who had played functional roles in the scheme at various levels while understanding its nature, all of them were processed through the legal system in subsequent rounds. Each conviction added to the total count. By December 2020, that total reached 109. 109 convictions. The number was historically unprecedented for a cryptocurrency fraud case. It reflected the comprehensive nature of the investigation, the decision to prosecute the scheme as a network rather than focusing only on the most visible figures at the top. It reflected the Chinese government's stated intention to send a clear message about cryptocurrency-enabled fraud, that participation at any level carried real legal consequences. And it reflected the specific capability that Chinese authorities had to investigate a scheme that had operated primarily within Chinese social and financial infrastructure, without the legal friction that cross-border investigations encounter at every step. The Chainalysis analysis of PlusToken's fund movements had produced a finding that reframed the case in ways that went beyond the criminal prosecution. A Ponzi scheme that accumulates billions of dollars in cryptocurrency and then collapses does not simply harm its direct victims. When the operators attempt to liquidate their holdings, they become a sustained source of selling pressure on the entire market. Chainalysis estimated that PlusToken had been selling between 25,000 and 45,000 Bitcoin per month throughout the second half of 2019. At the price levels of that period, that translated to hundreds of millions of dollars in monthly selling, not through any public exchange order book where the activity would be visible and attributed, but through OTC desks and mixing services that moved the funds quietly and gradually. The price of Bitcoin through the second half of 2019 and into early 2020 was suppressed in ways that analysts had found difficult to explain using normal market dynamics. After Chainalysis published its findings on PlusToken's liquidation pattern, the correlation was apparent. The months when PlusToken selling was highest corresponded to the months when Bitcoin prices experienced their largest declines or failed to recover as expected. Investors who had no knowledge of PlusToken, who had never encountered the platform, who had simply held Bitcoin through that period, had been affected by the scheme's liquidation. The losses from PlusToken extended outward through the market in ways that no simple victim count could capture. For the blockchain analytics industry, PlusToken represented a landmark of a different kind. The case demonstrated that the analytical tools the industry had developed, the clustering heuristics for identifying wallets under common control, the pattern recognition techniques for tracing funds through mixing operations, the methods for following cryptocurrency through OTC desk transactions, were capable of operating effectively at the scale of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of wallets. The technical questions that the analytics firms had built their businesses around were answered at the highest stakes level available by a case that required exactly those capabilities. The case also contributed to an accelerating conversation about systemic risk in cryptocurrency markets. Individual fraud cases had been treated primarily as law enforcement problems, crimes against specific victims to be prosecuted by specific authorities. PlusToken introduced with clarity and scale the idea that a sufficiently large fraud was also a market integrity problem. A pool of stolen cryptocurrency large enough to affect Bitcoin prices when liquidated created risks that extended beyond any single legal jurisdiction and affected participants who had no connection to the original crime. This framing would influence how regulators and market participants thought about cryptocurrency accumulation, liquidity, and systemic exposure in the years that followed. The case forced a broader reckoning with the specific danger of multi-level marketing structures in cryptocurrency. Traditional financial fraud reached victims through advertising, through impersonal mechanisms that did not leverage personal trust. The regulatory tools designed to police financial fraud were largely aimed at those mechanisms. PlusToken spread through social networks, through family relationships, through communities of shared interest. The person who vouched for the platform was someone you knew and trusted, who had personally experienced the returns and was sharing them in good faith. Regulatory frameworks designed to catch fraudulent advertising had nothing to say about fraudulent communities. The forensic challenge at the center of the PlusToken investigation was this: trace billions of dollars in cryptocurrency through a network of hundreds of wallets, multiple rounds of mixing, conversion between different assets, and transactions on OTC desks with minimal compliance records, and do it well enough to support criminal prosecution in a court of law. The operators had not made the task impossible. They had made it difficult, which is a different thing. The fundamental property of the blockchain that worked in investigators' favor was not merely that transactions were recorded. Everything in digital systems leaves records somewhere. What made the blockchain distinctive was that the records were public, immutable, and structured in a way that made relationships between transactions visible to anyone with the analytical tools to read them. The operators could shuffle coins. They could not hide the fact that coins had been shuffled. They could distribute funds across hundreds of wallets. They could not eliminate the behavioral patterns, the timing, the amounts, the sequence of operations that indicated those wallets were under common control. The coin mixing that PlusToken's operators employed created specific analytical challenges. In a mixing transaction, multiple parties combine their cryptocurrency into a pool and receive back equivalent amounts from the mixed pool, making it difficult to trace which input funded which output. Sophisticated mixing services used mathematical techniques, zero-knowledge proofs, ring signatures, and privacy-focused cryptocurrencies to make the input-output relationship genuinely untraceable. The mixing that PlusToken's operators used was less mathematically rigorous, which meant that the patterns of how they structured mixing transactions, the sizes of inputs and outputs, the timing of successive operations, the addresses they used before and after mixing, left analytical signatures that Chainalysis and other firms had developed techniques to identify. The OTC desk transactions presented a different kind of challenge. OTC desks operated as intermediaries between large buyers and sellers of cryptocurrency, facilitating trades that were too large to execute efficiently on public exchanges without moving prices. They did not generally report transaction details publicly, and their compliance requirements varied widely depending on their jurisdiction. For blockchain analysts, tracing funds through an OTC desk required identifying the wallets that sent funds to the desk, identifying the wallets that received funds on the other side, and establishing that the desk had been used as an intermediary, a task that required both blockchain analysis and, eventually, cooperation from the desk operators themselves or from exchanges where the funds surfaced after being processed. The collaboration between the analytical firms and Chinese law enforcement worked because each party brought capabilities the other lacked. The analytics firms had the technical tools to identify patterns in blockchain data at scale, to process millions of transactions, to build and test hypotheses about wallet clustering, to produce maps of fund flows that were detailed enough to be evidentiary. Law enforcement had the authority to act on that analysis, to obtain exchange compliance records that could link wallet addresses to real identities, to make arrests based on the intelligence the analysis provided, to compel cooperation from intermediaries that had processed the funds. The investigation was a collaboration in the most literal sense. Neither party could have achieved the same result without the other. Chinese authorities' domestic jurisdiction over most of PlusToken's infrastructure accelerated the investigation in ways that would not have been available in a more internationally distributed case. The WeChat groups that had been the scheme's primary community infrastructure were operated by a Chinese company and accessible to Chinese law enforcement through domestic legal channels. The domestic exchange accounts that many operators had used to receive funds were similarly accessible. The banking connections that linked cryptocurrency proceeds to real financial institutions were subject to Chinese regulatory authority. The legal obstacles that complicated international cryptocurrency investigations, the need to make separate requests to foreign jurisdictions at each evidentiary step, were largely absent here. PlusToken ended in the formal sense with the final convictions in December 2020. 109 people. The legal proceedings were concluded. The record was made permanent. What the case left behind was a set of precedents that extended well beyond the criminal outcomes. The first and most significant was investigative. Before PlusToken, there were open questions about whether blockchain forensics could operate effectively at the scale of billions of dollars, whether the complexity of sophisticated mixing and OTC liquidation strategies could be overcome by analytical techniques that were still relatively new, applied to a case that was orders of magnitude larger than anything they had previously addressed. After PlusToken, those questions were answered. The tools worked. The collaboration between analytics firms and law enforcement worked. The blockchain's permanent record, even partially obscured, was sufficient to support comprehensive prosecution. The second precedent was institutional. The relationship between blockchain analytics firms and law enforcement had existed before PlusToken, but had not been tested at anything like this scale or stakes. The investigation established working protocols and demonstrated the value of the partnership in ways that changed how both sides thought about cryptocurrency investigations going forward. Law enforcement agencies that had been uncertain about the practical utility of blockchain forensics became convinced by the PlusToken outcome. The investment in analytical capabilities, internal and through external partnerships, accelerated across multiple jurisdictions. The forensic infrastructure for investigating cryptocurrency fraud became substantially more capable in the years following the case. The third precedent was regulatory. PlusToken demonstrated that a Ponzi scheme of sufficient scale in cryptocurrency markets was not only a crime against direct victims, but a systemic market event, one that could depress prices for investors with no connection to the scheme through the forced liquidation of billions in stolen assets. This framing had not been clearly articulated before PlusToken. The Chainalysis research that documented the correlation between PlusToken selling and Bitcoin price suppression in 2019 provided evidence that market integrity concerns in cryptocurrency were not limited to manipulation of prices through order book activity, but extended to the systemic effects of large-scale fraud. For the cryptocurrency community, PlusToken was a warning that was understood selectively. The pattern the scheme demonstrated, a multi-level marketing structure, returns that were too consistent to be credibly produced by legitimate activity, social trust propagating through encrypted messaging networks, the specific vulnerability of communities where the memory of extraordinary gains made extraordinary promised returns seem plausible, would appear again. The technology would change. The specific promised return would shift. The community being targeted would be different. The structure would not change because the human dynamics the structure exploited do not change. The 194,775 Bitcoin and 833,083 Ethereum that PlusToken accumulated through the savings of more than 2 million people, most of it was never recovered. It had been liquidated through OTC desks, dispersed through mixing operations, converted and reconverted in ways that made full recovery effectively impossible, even with the blockchain record available. The convictions established accountability. They established that what happened was a crime, and that crimes have consequences. They did not undo the losses. They did not return the savings of the retired person who had trusted a cousin's recommendation, or the young professional who had put 6 months of income into an account they could no longer access. The legal system did what the legal system does. Recovery was a different question and had a different answer. Close your eyes one more time. In late July 2019, on a small island in the South Pacific that 6 people had chosen for its distance from everything, Chinese authorities arrived. The arrests were made. The extradition process began. The 6 operators who had believed that distance was sufficient found that the blockchain they had built their scheme on top of had recorded the trail they needed the world not to follow. The blockchain does not make judgments. It does not distinguish between honest transactions and fraudulent ones. It records all of them equally, permanently, in a structure that connects every transaction to every other transaction in its history. The operators who built PlusToken on top of the blockchain did not quite understand this, or understood it intellectually, but believed the complexity of their mixing and liquidation strategies would render the record unreadable. They were wrong about the readability. The record was there. 109 people were eventually convicted. The lead figure, Chen Bo, received 11 years in prison. 40 billion yuan, $6 billion US, had been taken from more than 2 million people across 4 countries. Most of that money was never recovered. The convictions came, the money did not follow. For the investors who lost savings, the closure the legal proceedings offered was real but incomplete. The particular grief of PlusToken was not only financial, it was relational. People had recommended this platform to the people they loved most, had staked their credibility, and it turned out their loved ones' savings on something they had experienced as genuine and trustworthy. The collapse left not just financial loss, but the knowledge that trust they had extended had been the mechanism by which the harm was delivered. That knowledge does not resolve cleanly, even when courts hand down sentences, even when years pass. What PlusToken revealed, at a scale that made the revelation impossible to ignore, was the specific vulnerability created by the convergence of cryptocurrency and social trust networks. The technology was not fraudulent. The blockchain worked exactly as designed, recording everything, preserving the evidence that would eventually convict the operators. What made the scheme possible was the environment surrounding the technology. The memory of extraordinary gains in 2017, the desire to participate in something that had already transformed other people's financial lives, the multi-level marketing structure that turned genuine believers into effective advocates, the encrypted messaging infrastructure that allowed a community of 2 million people to form and solidify before any regulator could map its contours. Those conditions shift and recombine. They do not disappear. The specific scheme disappears. The conditions that enabled it persist in new forms. This is the lesson that PlusToken teaches, stated plainly. The promise of extraordinary returns, testified to by people you trust, delivered through a platform that functions exactly as described, for a while, is not evidence of legitimacy. It is the mechanism by which a Ponzi scheme spreads. And the more extraordinary the promised return, the more carefully the promise deserves to be examined. Let those words settle now. Let the numbers drift, the 194,000 Bitcoin, the 109 convictions, the 2 million people. They are part of the permanent record. The blockchain holds them, along with everything else. And now the night holds you. Breathe slowly, let it be quiet.